everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York as we have learned more and more and more about the events of January 6th and the insurrection, and specifically the efforts of the twice impeached, disgraced ex-president to overturn his 2020 election defeat. It has become a glaring and unavoidable fact that former Vice President Mike Pence, one of the key characters in the story of January 6th, and the person on which the entire Trump coup plot relied on doing what Trump wanted him to do, he's never told a story. He's never testified about exactly what happened to him, or what made his whole family and a Secret Service detail run, or what happened to the country, for that matter, under oath. Well, today, we got news of a potential breakthrough on that front specifically. A federal judge has ordered Mike Pence to testify before the federal grand jury under oath. That grand jury, of course, is investigating the January 6th insurrection and Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Judge James E. Boasberg has rejected both Donald Trump and Mike Pence's efforts to block a subpoena from Special Counsel Jack Smith. New York Times reports this, quote, this month, Trump's lawyers asked Judge Boasberg's predecessor as chief judge for the court, that's Beryl A. Howell, to limit Pence's testimony by claiming that certain issues were off limits because of executive privilege that protects communications between the president and some members of his administration. At the same time, lawyers for Pence asked to limit his testimony by arguing that his role as president of the Senate means he's protected from legal scrutiny by the executive branch, including the Justice Department, under the Constitution's speech or debate clause. The judge's ruling was not a complete victory for Jack Smith. NBC News reports this, quote, the ruling from Judge James Boasberg, the chief judge for the U.S. District Court for D.C., said Pence does have some limited speech and debate protections. The immunity, however, would not prevent him from testifying about conversations where there's alleged illegality on Trump's part. Oh, yeah, that. Former VP Mike Pence ordered to testify before a federal grand jury is where we begin today with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater is here. Also joining us, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney, now a law professor at the University of Alabama. Charlie Sykes is back. He's the editor-at-large at The Bulwark. And with me at the table for the hour, Basil Smikle joins us. He's a Democratic strategist and director of the Public Policy Program at Hunter College. Luke, I start with you. You have reported this out from the moment it happened through the congressional probe into these acts, and specifically, one of the doors that was never unlocked by the 1-6 Select Committee was what was behind, what would come out of Mike Pence's mouth when asked questions like, what did he say to you? We only heard the words that were used. To the degree that we know it's the P word, one of Trump's favorites. It's because Ivanka shared that with her executive assistant. The 1-6 Select Committee was masterful in putting these pieces together, but we never heard from Pence himself. What does this ruling unlock?
Right. Well, it is a significant breakthrough. You know, if you talk to anybody on the January 6th committee that investigated this matter, you know, person number one is Donald Trump and person number two is Mike Pence, of all the people you want to get information from. And they never heard from either of those men in the end. Now, they did get a fair amount of information from some of Pence's top advisors. And we do know a fair bit about what happened between Donald Trump and Mike Pence, but we do not know everything. There are certain elements of certain conversations between Trump and Pence that have never been disclosed, but now may have to be. It appears from this judge's ruling, from what we're learning from this secretive process in court, that anything that has potential for criminality may have to be testified to by the former vice president. And we know that he has said that he believes President Trump put his life in danger and put his family's life in danger. We could hear a lot more about exactly what pressure was put on Pence. And we also do know that people involved in some of this pressure campaign with Mike Pence, specifically John Eastman, asked for a pardon afterwards, put it in writing that he thought he should be eligible for a pardon based on this pressure campaign that they had on the vice president. So they had some knowledge here that they had some legal exposure, potential criminality. And yeah, I think this is a huge breakthrough and will really open up the Justice Department's investigation.
So, Joyce, I want to just start And I want to focus where Luke has brought us on questions of criminality, because we know from the final sort of conclusions of the 1-6 Select Committee that there were 4 crimes specifically, and I've talked to Pat Hafey about this, that they specifically believe they amassed adequate evidence to make criminal referrals for. One was obstruction of an official proceeding. One was insurrection. One was fraud. And there's one that slips my mind with Trump. It's hard to keep track of all of the alleged criminality on his part. But I wonder if you can take us through, just start with obstruction of a criminal proceeding. What kind of questions would you ask Mike Pence in front of a grand jury if you were trying to prove that crime?
Sure. So I would have a lot of questions for Mike Pence, and call me old-fashioned, but I like my witnesses best under oath, especially witnesses who have avoided testifying for as long as Mike Pence has. So prosecutors will want to walk him through, I think, the entire course of conduct during the campaign to see if there's illegality during the campaign, if there's knowledge and an intent to challenge the election if he loses, and how early on that develops. You know, this evidence of obstruction, it's a broad theme across the Trump campaign, and Pence uniquely has conversations with Trump where no one else is present for both sides of them. So as we get into the specific sort of obstruction that involves the January 6th proceeding, Pence has always been a really essential witness. And of course, there's this notion of, was he threatened, or was there any effort to use inappropriate leverage with him to interfere with the outcome of the election? A lot of this comes down, and I should say that Judge Boasberg is known for being a very careful jurist. So we haven't seen the actual language in his order. We don't know how much latitude it gives Pence to try to duck questions, but there may well be litigation over specific questions as his testimony unfolds. And it's likely that while he will have to sit down and begin to answer, we haven't heard the last of court engagement in these proceedings.
So I like that Joyce led us somewhere very specific, Charlie Sykes. So was he threatened, and was there intent? Let me just start with what Donald Trump said on stages in public, starting around January 4th through January 6th.
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much. I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
The intent was abundantly clear to everyone with eyes and ears, Charlie Sykes.
Yeah, I mean, let's break this down. There are the legal issues, there are the political considerations, and then there are the moral obligations, or the obligations of somebody who is a public servant and a citizen of the United States who is sworn to uphold the Constitution. And I can't speak to all of the legal issues, but just take a step back. If you actually have evidence of the attempt by the President of the United States to subvert the Constitution of the United States, to obstruct an official proceeding, to incite an insurrection, what do you need to actually sit down and testify about that under oath? Isn't that one of the fundamental obligations, that if you have direct knowledge of a crime against the United States of America, isn't it something that should be incumbent upon you to come forward? And this is the big disappointment of Mike Pence, that he keeps hiding behind these strained legal arguments. And of course, you have people who are saying how politically unwise it would be for him to testify voluntarily. But at some point, you do have to put, I don't know that if some people might think it's corny, but you have to put your obligation to the Constitution and the country before all of those legal and political questions. And that's what really faces Mike Pence, that if he was in the room and he has direct knowledge of an illegal attempt to overthrow this election, if he has direct knowledge of an attempt by the President of the United States to aid and abet sedition, then, whether you're thinking about right now or his place in history, doesn't he have an overriding obligation to testify to that under oath?
Well, Charlie, of course he does. And only former Republicans suffering the PTSD of watching their own party align itself with the country's domestic violent extremist movement would couch it in this sort of defensive language of it may sound corny. Of course. Of course we're talking about duty. Of course we're talking about patriotism. And of course those words are hard to put it in a lot of sentences about Mike Pence, right? He had that one moment on January 6th for which we're all grateful. But that's just how pathetically low the bar is when you're talking about Republicans, especially Republicans in Trump's orbit. And again, I want to root all this in the facts as we know them, as Luke reported them on that day, as they've been developed by the 1-6 Select Committee. Here's what those words I just played from Trump and Eastman, that was the cause, this was the effect. Here are the rioters.
I am very concerned about Mike Pence. I have no idea what he's going to do. Did not love the way the president talked about that.
Pence lied to us. He's a total treasonous pig, and his name will be mud forever. Now the real battle begins.
Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence!
And I want to play one more piece of sound because we have Trump's words. We have what the rioters heard and plan to do. And here's the testimony, sworn testimony, presented by the 1-6 Select Committee of what the reaction was and what happens after all that from Mike Pence's Secret Service detail.
Last entry in the speech is, sirs, the Capitol does not sound good right now.
Correct.
What does that mean?
The members of the VP detail at this time were starting to fear for their own lives. There was a lot of yelling, a lot of very personal calls over the radio. So it was disturbing. I don't like talking about it, but there were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth. It was getting, for whatever the reason was on the ground, the VP detail thought that this was about to get very ugly.
So, Charlie, you talked about Mike Pence's duty to the country. How about his duty to the men and women who already testified before Congress, to the men and women who had the job of running him, not walking him? I traveled with the president for 6 years. I never ran anywhere. Maybe we should have, but I never ran anywhere. Running him down the stairs of the U.S. Capitol and making those calls as testified to by a witness by the 1-6 Select Committee to say goodbye to family members. What obligation does Pence have to them?
That alone should be enough. The obligation of the men and women who laid their lives on the line and feared for their lives that day. His obligation to his own family, which feared for their safety. All of that is true. And also remember that, what's happened since all of this, that you have, Donald Trump, when he sat down with Jonathan Karl, and Jonathan Karl asked him, what do you think about the hang Mike Pence chance? And Trump basically said, well, they were really mad. That he seemed to be comfortable with it. And then just over the weekend, you have Donald Trump standing down in Waco with his hand over his heart while they played an anthem from some of these seditionists who attacked the Capitol, who attacked these police officers. You have the president, the former president, continually reminding us that these were his people, that he incited it, he justified it, and now he is embracing it. And I'm hoping that the special counsel is keeping track of all of these comments that the president is making that reaffirm the fact that he was okay with what his supporters did, that he was okay with the attack, that he was okay with the threats against Mike Pence, which clearly were inspired by his words and his actions.
So, Basil, if you go back to the culmination of the 1-6 Select Committee's work, I think it was received as one of the surprise conclusions was that they referred insurrection, right? The crime of inciting an insurrection. I think people were largely expecting the obstruction of an official proceeding, the fraud statutes that they believe were violated. But I think we have all sort of, as a collective country, lowered the bar on what we expect Trump to be held accountable for, largely because he's been held accountable for nothing. And he commits his crimes in Costco-sized buckets, and he does it with impunity. And at the end of every scandal, he is emboldened, and it becomes more brazen. But if you stitch together the intent, which is in those statements, the knowledge of how his people reacted, what's in the public record about how Pence's own people protecting the Vice President of the United States acted, and then you look at sort of the legal architecture, which was all done ahead of time, it was all put on paper. Let me just play this and then ask you about premeditation.
Was it your impression that the vice president had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
You've been clear repeatedly with Mr. Meadows about you and the vice president having a different view about his authority on January 6th.
I believe I had.
Did Mr. Meadows ever explicitly or tacitly agree with you or say, yeah, that makes sense, or okay?
I believe that Mark did agree.
During that meeting on the 4th, I think I raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even what he viewed as the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions.
So I don't know that this hit me at the time the way it hit me now, but Mark Short testifies that Pence told Trump, quote, many times directly that he did not have the authority to do that. The sound I played starts January 4th, but it goes through the 6th. Now, I worked in the White House. A vice president doesn't see a president many times. Right. I mean, how far? I mean, if you get Pence under oath, there could be a dozen conversations about Trump's coup plot.
Oh, I hope he is incredibly loquacious under oath. I hope he spills his guts. I don't know that we'll ever see that. But to Charlie's earlier point, if not for the country, at least for your family, he should be standing on the mountaintops and yelling and screaming about every conversation he had with Donald Trump and how problematic it was for himself, for Congress, and for the country. Everything that you've described suggests that this was not a spontaneous act. This was maybe not months or weeks, but certainly days prior to what happened on January 6th, that there was conversation about what Trump wanted to do and what he was intent on pushing his lieutenants to do. And I think there should be a chilling effect for everyone running for president right now in the GOP. Because if you want to cozy up to Donald Trump, this is what to expect, that he's going to be making these calls to you and he's going to be pushing you in the way that he pushed Pence to act in his favor at the risk of putting your family in danger. For anyone that wants to be his vice president, should he actually go ahead and run, understand that Mike Pence is laying out for you the peril that you and your family will go through if you cozy up to this man. So I do hope that he speaks volumes in this testimony. I don't know if we'll ever see it, don't know if we'll ever come out before the election, but the fact of the matter is that none of these events were spontaneous. This is who Donald Trump is. This is who he expects all of his followers and supporters to be. And if he's calling and incites people to call Mike Pence treasonous, I'm sure he's not done.
Yeah, I mean, look, I pull some of these data points out because I think when we think about Pence going in to talk to Trump, we think about the call on the morning of the 6th. But if Mark Short has already testified, pick up on that. Was it your impression the vice president directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president? And his position, and Judge Ludig testified to this in the public hearings, was that he didn't have the authority to overturn the results. That he directly communicated these issues to the president. This was a question about private conversations between Pence and Trump, not just to the world through a dear letter, but directly to President Trump. Short, quote, many times. Jack Smith has a potential gold mine of evidence that could slide the timeline back to even before Election Day. And we know Tom Fitton also was working in July before the election to overturn the results should Trump come up short, which suggests they can read a poll, but not the Constitution. Talk about the significance of the unanswered questions about the timeline presented by the 1-6 Select Committee.
Right. You could get into Donald Trump's intent much earlier than we previously than is previously known right now. You know, the thing I think this could really get at is connecting the dots for people. Trump has said so much publicly that seemed to imply that he was using the mob as a pressure tool on Pence, right? I mean, just recently he went out to the media and said there wouldn't have been a riot, there wouldn't have been an attack on the Capitol had Pence just done the right thing. And so what he's doing is he's suggesting that all along the plan was to use this huge crowd of people to pressure him to keep him president. He just says it out loud over and over again. And so circumstantially, you have from the facts that are on the table, it seems a very obvious case here. But what can Mike Pence say that happened behind the scenes? How early did it happen? Mm-hmm. And those are the extra gaps that he can fill in for this grand jury as they move forward.
And Joyce, I share Basil's hope that he's loquacious, but I don't have any optimism that he will be. But conversely, he can't lie, right?
Well, lying would, of course, expose him to the possibility of perjury. So I think you're right. He won't be loquacious. And I just have to say something about duty here, because like you, I served a president. I was a presidential appointee. I took the oath of office, but it was an oath to the Constitution, not to President Obama. And President Obama, when he spoke to the United States attorneys assembled as a big group, told us that we worked for the citizens of the United States, that we weren't his United States attorneys. And most people who take those jobs, you never expect your sense of duty to country to be tested, because we have always been a functional American democracy. But in this moment of great and unanticipated stress, maybe we should have anticipated it more with Trump, but I doubt Mike Pence thought his life would be threatened during his service to country. Your obligation is not measured by the easy times. Your obligation is measured by the hard times. The fact that Mike Pence hasn't come forward before now, that it's taken a subpoena, I think is appalling. His obligation should have become apparent to him as soon as he knew that the president that he was serving was violating the Constitution. And we can debate when that was. Luke has a great sense of the timeline, I think. There's a possibility that it's pre-election. Certainly it happens as January 6th is approaching. And Mike Pence fails the oath that he took. I agree that he did something important on January 6th, but he has a duty that he has not yet fulfilled. This is awfully close to his last chance.
I also think that if you're being realistic, Charlie Sykes, and you really can read the Republican Party, and I don't hold myself out as someone who understands much of it, the minute they erected a gallows to hang you was when your presidential aspirations were over, because that was where the heat of the Republican Party was. That's where it still lies. That's where the energy is. And their mission statement was to, quote, hang Mike Pence. The idea that he's trying, I don't even know what needle he's trying to thread him with what.
Yeah, he cannot thread the needle. So I actually spent the morning talking with Judge Ludig, Judge Michael Ludig, who had sent that tweet out right before January 6th, telling Mike Pence, you do not have the power to do that. And it was really the tweet heard around the world. Mm-hmm. And during my discussion with him, it's for the Bulwark podcast, Judge Ludig looks at where we are at right now. One of the consequences, I think, of the failure of Mike Pence and other Republicans to push back against this, to separate themselves from this, is that we are still in an incredibly dangerous moment. We are in a moment of real constitutional peril. And it's hard to overstate the fact that we're not just talking about something that happened 2 years ago. We're thinking about what could possibly happen in the future. What are these people capable of tolerating? What is going to happen with the 2024 election? What other mobs might he call? So there is a price to be paid for Mike Pence not doing his duty to the country, that we're still living through this and may live through something even worse in the future.
We're just taking a break. I do want to come back on this point, though, that you've all made in different ways. I mean, Donald Trump, of course, has a lot to fear if Mike Pence testifies under oath and truthfully before a federal grand jury. But so might the 19 Republicans who assembled in the Roosevelt Room to plot the coup, as well as I don't know, isn't it Ron Johnson who had a package he was trying to get to Mike Pence, as though none of them have staffers? Lots more on this new legal breakthrough. Also, when we come back, officials are still trying to investigate and better understand the motive behind yesterday's horrific and tragic school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee. Another mass murder in this country. On the books now, part of our history as our growing gun violence epidemic is shrugged off by some on the right yet again. What's being done to prevent another one? And later in the program, an important hearing this afternoon in the $1.6 billion, that's with a B, dollar defamation lawsuit against Fox News and the fight over Rupert Murdoch's testimony. We'll bring you all those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Hi, I'm Tom Llamas, and for me, the news is so much more than a headline. It informs, it inspires, and it still matters. To cover it, you have to be in it. We'll take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. In primetime and streaming live, it's your news playlist. Join me for Top Story, weeknights at 7 Eastern on NBC News Now.
Luke Broadwater, Joyce Vance, Charlie Sykes, Basil Smykel are still with us. Luke, I want to pick up on this thread about the other Republicans. In the debacle that was Kevin McCarthy's ascension, if we call it that, to the speakership, much was made of the pardon sought by Trump allies, the same people who were extorting him in the final hours and days over that gavel. But the truth is, there's not a lot of evidence that any of them have been held to account the way they thought they should be. In seeking pardons, as people pointed out, they thought they might have some criminal exposure. Just talk about what Mike Pence might know or have to say about the role of Republican members of the House or maybe even the Senate in trying to overturn the election results. Something he knew was illegal. He called Dan Quayle. He consulted Judge Ludig. He knew it was wrong.
Right. Yeah. I actually do not know how much Mike Pence knows about what all the specific members of Congress were doing. I assume he must have picked up on some of that stuff at his time in the White House, right? He must have heard something, understood what was happening at different moments. That said, we do know, Mo Brooks wrote a letter, an email to the president asking for these blanket pardons for all of the Republicans who were involved in the effort to overturn the election. So they believed that they had criminal exposure here. Now, I have not seen a ton of evidence that the Justice Department is going after any of them. We know that Scott Perry, the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, his phone was seized, but we were told that he was not the target of that investigation, and that investigation was looking at Jeffrey Clark, the lawyer who Trump had considered installing atop the Justice Department. So as of right now, there has not been a ton of scrutiny on these congressional Republicans from law enforcement. And in fact, the January 6th committee referred ethics complaints against 4 of these Republicans. We've not yet received any indication that the ethics committee has opened an investigation into any of them. So as of right now, they're in charge of committees, they're running the House of Representatives, and so they are empowered in the Republican-led House and not at all on their heels right now.
Not on their heels. But the reason we know that they know that they may have committed crimes is because more than a dozen of them sought presidential pardons.
That's right. And look, to me, and I go back to the point about this wasn't a spontaneous act. If you have your president of the United States, the president of the United States, and the vice president having these conversations, you think that a member of Congress who would be engaged in those conversations anyway with the president and vice president did not know or have any clue that this was being discussed, that there were going to be potential consequences for anybody that did not follow through on what Donald Trump wanted. There's a legal standard, I'm sure, but politically, I have to think that a lot more people knew than are being held accountable for at this point. And so, again, I go back to the earlier point. There are people in positions of power, as Luke talked about, that are running committees, that are voting on public policy right now, that may never ever be held accountable for what happened. And that's why you see in places like New York, independents now outnumber Republicans in the state. And I'm sure it's a trend that's happening around the country, not so much because it's an end of conservatism, but it's a sign that there are a lot of folks that just want to get away from Donald Trump, get away from this madness, and find an alternative. If New York elected officials have to hold a press conference to come to the defense of Alvin Bragg because they're concerned for his safety, Donald Trump's words have strength among even a very small but very intense group of supporters. And that should sow concern among multiple pockets of this country, many more so that are speaking up about it. And so, yeah, I think these Republicans should be held accountable. They probably will not be, but there is always Election Day.
See, you're doing what Charlie did. They probably will not be. We're all beaten down. So I'm coming back to you, Charlie. Again, this is not a delusion on the left. This is evidence from Republican West Wing staffer Cassidy Hutchinson's sworn testimony to the 1-6 Select Committee about the members seeking federal pardons. It included Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mr. Perry. I think there were a dozen in all. So those members, in their own words, in their own conversations with Trump administration officials, sought presidential pardons, not to hang on the wall, not as office art, because they were worried they'd committed crimes. Where is DOJ? Why aren't any? I mean, I'm sure Luke Broadwater's reporting and analysis is spot on. None of them seem to be under scrutiny.
I see you're pressing my buttons here because this is what is so frustrating. The fact that we're coming up on 27 months since the insurrection, and there have been hundreds of the protesters and the rioters who have been criminally charged, but none of the architects for all of them. There have been no consequences for anyone in the administration or the lawyers who were sitting in that room or the members of Congress who had the consciousness of guilt, I think, required to ask for a pardon. 27 months is a very, very long time now. Maybe they will eventually get around to doing something about it. But, you know, justice delayed is justice denied, and it has allowed this revisionist history to take hold. It has allowed these members of Congress to feel somehow that they are untouchable along with Donald Trump. And I think that that's dangerous. So I share the frustration. One can only hope that Jack Smith is not totally beaten down, or that Merrick Garland understands that if you're going to go at this, if this really was a coup attempt, then they need to go big, and they need to go after all of the conspirators, all of the people who are part of that design to attack the American democracy. I'll be satisfied in many ways if they get Trump, but quite frankly, justice is not done until every one of those conspirators is held to account in a court of law.
Yeah, I mean, Joyce, let's leave Jack Smith out of it for a minute. He's new to the scene, and he seems to be pursuing the cases assigned to him by Merrick Garland aggressively. But the calendar is what the calendar is. And the fact that nothing appears to have happened in the first 12 to 18 months after the insurrection is still a black box to me. Why not?
I have the same question, and we don't know. Did DOJ not have the appetite for that first year? Were they quietly operating behind the scenes? That has always seemed very unlikely to me, because we saw what happened as soon as DOJ kicked it into gear. Witnesses began to object to subpoenas. Word that they were in the space began to leak out. So that year is something that I think Merrick Garland will ultimately be accountable to all of us for. But, you know, when we say no one is above the law in this country, we are not talking only about the president. And I can't think of a clearer case where people shouldn't be above the law than when we're talking about people who are involved in fomenting an insurrection. We've seen prosecutions of the people who answered that call, answered that summons to come to Washington and overran the Capitol. to not scrutinize the behavior of what Charlie, I think, really appropriately calls the architects seems to me to be a real miscarriage of justice. So I want to be careful to say that just because something appears to be a crime doesn't always mean that prosecutors end up with sufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. To not investigate would be a real abdication of duty here. And this fact that Mike Pence will now testify under subpoena to sort of come full circle might open up new opportunities. We don't know what conversations Pence, who was a creature of the House, might have had with some of his former colleagues or people who were currently in the House. It may be that he has something to add. He certainly has tried to avoid testifying for as long and is in as many ways as possible.
I mean, Luke, as Joyce is talking, I'm just thinking, you know, a simple question for Mike Pence. Why didn't you get in the car? Why'd you stay?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, why didn't you get in the car? Do we know the answer to that from him?
I would love to hear his take on that. You know, we've heard Jamie Raskin talk about that a great deal. We've heard Mark Short talk about that. You know, my understanding, according to his aides, was that he did not want the visual of being rushed out of the Capitol. And he was also concerned that they would not finish the job if he was taken away from the Capitol. And he wanted to go back in and do his constitutional duty. So there's, you know, he definitely did his duty that day. And by staying at the Capitol and denying the Secret Service's ask that he be whisked away, he helped ensure the transfer of power and American democracy continue as we've known it for hundreds of years. So, but yeah, I mean, he should be, you know, he will be under oath now. He will have to testify before a judge and before this grand jury. And I think we'll finally, hopefully, get to hear exactly what happened between him and Trump in the buildup to one of the darkest days in American history.
And I think, Luke, to your point, why didn't you get in the car? Unlocks everything about premeditation. I worked in the White House for 6 years. I've never heard of any protectee defying the Secret Service. What were you worried about? Where'd you think they would take you? Why did you think you wouldn't get the job done? He must have already known that at the Capitol and at the White House, a division existed, and he was on one side of it, and Trump was on the other. And I think we're talking about Mike Pence under oath. We always sort of ascribe these maniacal political ambitions, and that's all true. But if you can't lie, as Joyce said, simple questions like, why didn't you get in the car? Could be incredibly incriminating for Donald Trump and his allies. Luke, Joyce, Charlie, thank you so much for starting us off and having this conversation with us. Basil sticks around a little bit longer. When we come back, police in Nashville, Tennessee today trying to pick up the pieces and piece together how yesterday's school shooter amassed enough guns to kill 6 people, including 3 children, at an elementary school there. Republicans in that state and around the country say regulating those weapons is not the answer. We'll talk about what is on the other side next.
It was a pitch black night in the high desert. Sheriff's Deputy Billy Cox drove over the park and ride in Palmdale. Something very wrong around that bright blue Mustang. A woman's left leg and bare foot were hanging out of the door. L.A. County Homicide Detective Richard Longshore was sound asleep when he got the call.
There are cases that you will take home with you at night, and that will last till the end of your life.
I'm Keith Morrison, and this is The Girl in the Blue Mustang, a podcast from Dateline.
Listen now for free wherever you get your podcasts.
We've determined that Audrey bought 7 firearms from 5 different local gun stores here legally. They were legally purchased. 3 of those weapons were used yesterday during this horrific tragedy that happened. She was under care, doctor's care, for an emotional disorder, but her parents felt that she should not own weapons. They were under the impression that when she sold the one weapon that she did not own anymore. As it turned out, she had been hiding several weapons within the house.
That was Nashville Police Chief John Drake. We heard from him again today. That was from earlier on the stockpile of weapons. Yesterday's school shooter had been allowed legally to gather, 3 of which were brought to the Covenant School for the mass shooting, leaving 3 9-year-old children and 3 adults in the school murdered. Officials have released body camera footage showing the events inside the school. I'm going to show you a little bit of it because it's important to see, but it is very hard to watch. If you need a second to close your eyes or walk out, take it now. The footage shows officers quickly entering the building, going from classroom to classroom in an effort to secure the school before exchanging the final gunfire with the shooter. From the time police got word that there was an active shooting taking place to the time the shooter was killed, 14 minutes elapsed. We learned that yesterday in that first briefing. Joining us now, the president of the Gun Violence Prevention Group, Brady, Chris Brown, and Basil still with us. Chris, you've got this indisputable fact from this frontline law enforcement official who was one of the first voices we heard from yesterday. We heard from him again today. And just this is only a sentence that can be uttered in America. The shooter had amassed 7 firearms, legally. How is that possible?
Yeah. Well, because we haven't strengthened our background check system, because Tennessee, the state where this happened, does not have an extreme risk protection law. It's heartbreaking to hear what you reported, Nicolle, which is that the family knew and attempted to remove guns, but didn't know that this person was amassing other guns. In a state that had an extreme risk law, they could have gotten an extreme risk protection order that could have prevented that kind of activity. Tennessee has not passed one, and it's really kind of unconscionable. I don't know what other word to put to it, because Congress last year passed a bipartisan Safer Communities Act that provides funds to states to incent them to pass these laws to prevent these exact kinds of tragedies. And unfortunately, it's become politicized like so much. And we have, I'm sorry to say, folks on one side of the ledger, Republicans, who are standing in the way of that kind of action, saying that somehow the Second Amendment would be infringed by this. The only thing being infringed by that kind of action are our children's lives. We have the #1 killer of our kids in America today, surpassing traffic fatalities. And we have to do much more. But the solutions are right before us. They're not hard. It's just states need to act like Tennessee, and we need more action also at the federal level.
Why can't you penetrate the right? I mean, when kids were dying in car accidents, there were seatbelt laws, there were car seat laws even before there were seatbelt laws. The front seat, back seat thing is a law in, I think, almost every state. Why can't you have a rational conversation with a Republican about maybe everyone only needs 1 gun, not 7. Maybe if you're emotionally disturbed, you get 0, not 1 or 7. Why can't Republicans come to the table and do on the gun question what we've done on what used to be the #1 killer of kids, vehicular accidents?
They must not believe in an afterlife the way that they claim in public, because I can't answer that question easily. I'll tell you a story about why I think it's really hard. I sat down with Marco Rubio about 4 years ago, and I took him through how easy it is to buy an assault-style weapon in America, because he lives in a state where it's really easy to do that. You can go on a website and you can look up AR-15, and in minutes, you can complete a private transaction with a seller, because he has not expanded the Brady law all across this country, with a seller that does not technically have to do background checks. And I showed him this. It was about 5 miles from his house, where he could have bought this assault style weapon in a Safeway parking lot. And Nicolle, he was shocked. He was so upset. He wanted to do something about this. And 3 days later, we contacted him and got no response. And the reality is, it's about money in politics, and it's about people like Marco Rubio being very concerned about the primaries. and having folks who can come into these primaries who are extremists who will unseat them. And obviously, they must not believe in an afterlife because they know the consequences of what they are doing, and they sit by with something to do, not like the rest of us. I can't vote on these things. If I could, I would. And they do nothing. And we have to, all of us, including everyone in media, hold them to account because our children are dying. The number one killer of kids is guns. And so we can make a difference, but we have to hold them to account. And that's what it's about. It's nothing else than that.
There's so much more to say. And you know, there's a lot of enthusiasm for passing laws about drag shows and other things. But I don't know. I was on the air yesterday. Nobody was killed at a drag show. We have to sneak in a quick break. Chris Brown, Basil Smichels are staying with us. Please do the same. We'll be right back.
3 precious little kids lost their lives, and I believe 3 adults, and the shooter, of course, lost their life too. So it's a horrible, horrible situation, and we're not going to fix it. Criminals are going to be criminals.
Do you think there's any role for Congress to play in reaction to this tragedy?
I don't see any real role that we could do other than mess things up.
What should be done to protect people like your little girl from being safe at school?
Well, we homeschool her.
That's one thing, I guess, anyone could choose to do. That's it, though, in a nutshell, right? That was, you can't make this up at this point. That was a Republican congressman from Tennessee, Tim Burchett, basically shrugging off this shooting in terms of doing anything to stop the next one by saying there's, quote, nothing that can be done. We're back with Chris Brown and Basil Smichels. I think whether he's right or wrong isn't for me to say, but I don't think that's where the public is. I think 85% of the public would like to do one thing, and that's background checks. I think the numbers are just as high in terms of banning assault weapons. And I think the more, I mean, I hope everybody sees that. I hope he goes on Fox tonight and says nothing. Because I think even that audience would like to do something.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, the nonchalance coming off of him is stunning. Even if you don't think that Congress will act on it, stand up at least for the people in your state. I mean, that's at the bare minimum, right? Stand up for those families that lost 9-year-olds in your state.
Or stand with the legal gun owners who are not opposed to background checks.
That's exactly right. Listen, there was a former law enforcement official that said, I heard say something earlier about if we start arming the police officers in the way that some of these shooters are armed, we'd be the, quote, third world country. First of all, I hate that term. But the point that I'm making is that he's trying to make this analogy and saying we're not really them. The fact of the matter is we are a profoundly and unequivocally violent nation. And when you have, if you've seen the body camera footage, these officers walking into classrooms with the little coats and the bags and the books.
Unbearable.
When we always say we're going to, if it's children, that's the line we're not going to cross. We're going to do something about it. We have not done anything about it. I don't know if we ever will do anything about it in the near future. And that's really what's so profoundly sad about this moment in time, that the evidence is there and no one will be willing to act. And sort of piggybacking on our previous segment, the architects of these laws and these policies are essentially making statements like what was just made and walking away from it while people are being shot and killed on the ground. Children are being shot and killed on the ground.
But people need to understand this. Republicans need you to believe that nothing is all that can be done. I don't think voters will accept that.
Absolutely.
Voters have never accepted that. Voters traditionally come to the polls in November in presidential years, especially believing that things can change. And so I actually think that was a tragic thing to say as a member of Congress from that state's delegation. But I think as a political mission statement, it's an idiotic position for the Republicans to maintain.
Carolyn McCarthy, Lucy McBath all ran against people who were protective of gun rights, protective of the violence that comes from illegal gun ownership and an abuse of gun ownership. If it takes just individuals or IEs putting candidates up against these folks, do everything we can. But we've got to make a change.
And you've got to have people that believe that something can be done, because it can. We choose to live like this by sending people like that to Congress. Chris Brown, thank you so much for joining our conversation on this. Basil, thank you so much for spending the hour at the table. Up next for us, the Dominion case against Fox News. The judge just this afternoon, a couple hours ago, sounding like he's putting the cable network on notice. We'll explain all that's going on inside that hearing after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
As reported, as you know, you're facing a lot of legal challenges. In your opinion, does this help you or hurt you in terms of your chances to win in 2024?
I don't know whether it helps or hurts. I can tell you, in my opinion, it's a new way of cheating on elections. It's called election interference. What they're doing is if they can't win at the ballot box, they're going to do this kind of stuff.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. Speaking of legal problems, a new chapter in the parasitic can't live with them, can't live without them dynamic between two of the most important architects of the alternate reality, the Earth 2, that today's Trumpian Republican Party lives in. The disgraced, twice impeached ex-president, who's under lots of legal scrutiny, as Sean Hannity just said, and Fox News, which is also facing a lot of legal scrutiny. In case you missed it, and I'm guessing you did, the twice impeached ex-president appeared last night with Sean Hannity, who's an important figure in the $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit. The ex-president, interestingly, went on that network's airwaves and peddled his bogus and disproven election conspiracies at the heart of that defamation suit. He called the multiple criminal investigations into his actions before, during, and after his presidency election interference. It's an effort at rebranding, we think. Donald Trump is, if anything, though, a master of projection. His delusions and rantings and conspiracies about a deep state, the election, and Democrats aside, the timing of Trump's appearance on Fox News is notable because it comes at a time when efforts by Dominion to hold Fox News accountable for the lies it broadcast on its programs exposed how those at Fox News privately dismissed and disparaged and despised Trump and his election fraud claims. Today, a pivotal and at times fiery hearing in that specific case. Lawyers from Dominion and lawyers from Fox laying out their wish lists of witnesses they'd like to call during the trial that begins in less than 1 month. Both sides seem interested in calling some familiar names from Fox's airwaves and in its C-suite. One Rupert Murdoch, his son Lachlan, the anchor Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, Jeanine Pirro, Brett Baer, Maria Bartiromo, Lou Dobbs, and Fox's CEO, Suzanne Scott. And one potentially explosive name on that witness list, you may not have heard of her yet, but you will, Abby Grossberg, the woman who was, until Friday, a Fox News producer. She's now suing her former employer, Fox News, making some shocking allegations, laying out how she was pressured by Fox's legal team into giving misleading testimony. Grossberg now says she, quote, will never testify on behalf of Fox News and will only voluntarily testify, if at all, on behalf of Dominion. That comes from an amended complaint filed yesterday where she also is seeking to correct her previous testimony, alleging that attorneys for Fox News, quote, intimidated and coerced her, tricked her into doubting her own faculties, left her with the impression that she must answer questions evasively and be, quote, as boring as possible. And this, quote, that she had to downplay the importance of show ratings, as this would suggest a motive for why Fox News had allowed the stories about Dominion to go on the air in the first place. Ding, ding, ding. It's all making sense, right? It's where we begin the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Ronelle Anderson is back. She's a law professor and First Amendment scholar at the University of Utah. With us at the table, New York Times political reporter Jeremy Peters. He's an MSNBC contributor, an expert on all things Fox News and Dominion. So this feels like the most important piece of the Grossberg lawsuit, and let's just start there. She was coached into saying that there was no consideration of ratings. When we know from Dominion's discovery that ratings drove everything from Murdoch to Tucker to Laura to Hannity. It made them want to fire the fact checker who was correcting some of these things. If they just let the fact checker check the facts, they might not have been sued for $1.6 billion.
Well, that's exactly right. Had they just done what Fox News did after every time a Democrat won the White House and let things play out for a few weeks, weeks, we wouldn't be in this situation. Fox wouldn't potentially be on the hook for $1.6 billion, as you say. But there was such a panic inside the network at this drop in the ratings. And let's be real here. It probably only would have been temporary, right? I mean, this is something that happens every year.
This is important. Explain this. I mean, Fox News became the juggernaut that it is during the Clinton-Obama presidency.
Exactly. It was all, and Roger Ailes, the former CEO and co-founder of the network, actually told people it was better for Fox to have a Democrat in the White House than a Republican, because Fox always got ignored by Republican administrations. He felt like the Bush administration in particular kind of pushed Fox to the side and said, no, we don't really need to worry about you. And it also kind of bored their audience. They weren't as interested because it wasn't adversarial television. To have a Democrat in the White House, that's adversarial television. It was good television. It was combative, and that's what made them such a ratings powerhouse. Since 2002, they have never not been number one in the ratings. Now they are, this most recent quarter, not just the biggest name in, or the most highly rated network in cable news. They're the most highly rated network in all of cable. I mean, think about that for a minute.
What is the significance of today's hearing? Can you take us through what happened?
So the significance of, from what I heard, from what I could tell, is the judge is starting to get very impatient with what he sees as Fox's efforts to obstruct and delay the proceedings. And in one case in particular, he was very irritated that Fox had objected to the introduction of every single exhibit that Dominion wants the jury to see. And he warned Fox's lawyers, look, if you keep this up at trial, I am not going to be a very happy person. So, given his body language, from what I'm told in previous hearings and some of the rulings that he has issued against Fox lately, if I were Fox's lawyers, I would be very concerned about getting off on the wrong foot with this judge. That's what it looked like to me.
Renell, this is Fox's second legal team, as I understand it. The first one got them to this place to begin with. One of the altercations, as I understand it, I was getting ready to come on the air, so if you have more information, fill our viewers and me in on that, was about Rupert Murdoch's appearance itself. Is that right?
Yes. There is a fight between the two parties as to whether Rupert Murdoch has enough pertinent information for this suit to be required to come as a witness, and secondarily, whether if he does get called as a witness, whether he needs to be there in person. Fox has argued vociferously that he is too far removed from the decision-making in this individual case. The question of whether the material would air about Dominion, that is the core of this suit. And because he's so far removed from that, ought not be a party to this suit at all. The judge seemed not to be warm to that argument. He didn't answer the question, but left open the possibility that Murdoch could have enough information and could be pertinent enough that he would need to be called. He also left open the question of whether if he is called, he and others will be required to be there in person, although has suggested in last week's hearings that he has a preference for in-person testimony.
I want to ask you, Renell, too, about Ms. Grossberg, who we were just talking about, and which parts of what she's alleging her now former employer coached her to do could damage Fox legally. I want to read this from her complaint. Quote, during the deposition prep sessions, Ms. Grossberg was shown two text exchanges from November 8th, 2020 and November 9th, 2020 to review that made it clear that a particularly troubling segment in which Rudy Giuliani made unfounded allegations about widespread election fraud had been pre-taped and thus could have been edited or prevented from airing by Mr. Clark, the senior VP of weekend programming. In order to cover up this omission, the Fox News attorney coached Ms. Grossberg to say that the segment was live to tape so as to imply that it could not have been edited in between taping and airing. You don't even have to work in this business to understand that anything that exists on tape could be modified. It can be re-edited. It can have something put over it to clarify, or it could be yanked. I mean, that seems like an outrageous little tidbit of the kind of thing she was asked to testify to.
Yes. So this suit is particularly explosive, coming on the heels of the developments in the Dominion case. And it's interesting, the interconnections between the two of them, because at core, her suits, the two suits that she's brought in New York and in Delaware are alleging that she was sort of hung out to dry, and that they are part and parcel of a larger suit that are about sex discrimination. She says that this was a misogynistic culture and that there was widespread discrimination on the basis of her gender. But core to that argument is that among the ways that this misogyny within the culture manifested itself was that she was boxed into a corner in the preparation for her depositions for the Dominion case, and that there was an effort to foist the blame onto her and potentially the female host for whom she worked, rather than have it be landing on the shoulders of higher-ups who were mostly male in the Fox universe. And so one of the key things that's happening here is that as she's correcting some of that deposition testimony and suggesting that she was pushed to give that testimony because of this culture of sex discrimination, she is connecting some really important dots between the immediate decision to make the statements that were made on those shows about Dominion and some of the folks higher up in the corporate culture. A lot of what we've said all along here is that one of the main challenges that Dominion has faced is being able to connect those dots between the immediate decision to publish the information about Dominion and folks who are elsewhere in the Fox universe. And there's some question about whether this might be the testimony that does that. She might be able to connect those dots and create that link between the decisions that are at the subject of the Dominion suit and the wider evidence that exists within the corporate parent.
I mean, Jeremy, Ronell gave us so much to unpack. And first of all, on this culture that Ms. Grossberg describes as misogynistic, I mean, the Times had some of the earliest and best reporting on the settlements paid on behalf of O'Reilly, and the movie Bombshell chronicles the culture that women that came out of Fox, Gretchen Carlson, perhaps most famously, sort of blew the whistle on and told the world what it was really like. What she does in terms of the culture as just a stepping stone in this case, it may end up being adjacent to it and not part of it, is a fascinating another look inside Fox News. But to Ronell's point about what her testimony could do as if she, as she says, becomes a witness for Dominion, it is the re-airing. And you can easily stitch together an original broadcast, a dozen more communications from Tony Fratto or someone else on behalf of Dominion. And then you have to press buttons. You have to you affirmatively re-air something. And if you've got all the evidence that you're in receipt of after the original live show is aired, saying this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong, and then someone affirmatively pushes it back out to your, as you said, it's a massive audience watching Fox News, even on the weekends. That seems incredibly damaging legally.
And this is why Abby Grossberg was always going to be such an interesting witness to begin with, well before she filed her lawsuits. She and Maria Bartiromo are, their testimony and the discovery that we've seen from their text messages with each other is some of the most damning to Fox of this whole trial to have been produced, or this whole case to have been produced so far. Abby Grossberg was the one who says to Maria Bartiromo that she didn't think that the audience cared to hear about a peaceful transition. She's the one who said under oath that she didn't think it was really necessary to correct false information that had been put onto the air. Now, she's seeking to revise some of that testimony and say, well, no, I did actually think it was important to correct false information, but I just didn't think Maria pushed hard enough. So she was already going to be a damaging witness. Now she's seeking to be an even more damaging one by saying what she claims she was really thinking at the time. And that's in effect that Fox was acting recklessly in its pursuit of these Dominion stories and rumors. And that's at the heart of Dominion's case. Can it prove that enough people inside Fox were acting recklessly? And it certainly looks like from the evidence we've seen so far that that's a very persuasive thing they will be able to argue to a jury.
And a jury's going to hear, if they hear from her, you can't sort of read very far in this lawsuit without seeing that what she believes as part of the motive is a misogynistic and sexist culture. As someone who sort of knows this part of the Republican Party and its media echo chamber, I know there's no part of this that's surprising, but it is still stark to see it in black and white from someone deep inside that network's culture.
And some of the stuff that Grossberg says she was subjected to is really ugly, ugly stuff. But this was all supposed to have changed with the exit of Roger Ailes and the revamping or the supposed revamping of the culture inside Fox News, which, by the way, now at the very highest levels is run mostly by women. This was supposed to have changed. But Abby Grossberg is saying, and I'm sure there are many women inside the network who would disagree with her, but what she's saying is, no, it's the same old, same old.
I'm not sure how many would disagree. I want to add to our conversation Jason Johnson, journalism and politics professor at Morgan State University, an MSNBC contributor on the topic of Fox News and its exposure here in the defamation lawsuit, as well as this conversation we've been having about someone from deep inside Fox News now suing her former employer for trying to scapegoat her, describing a misogynistic culture and things being re-aired. Your thoughts?
Well, first off, Nicolle, it never ceases to amaze me. I was never shocked by Fox being involved in this. I was never shocked by Fox lying or working in cahoots with the Republican Party. But the particular section where she talks about people didn't care about being wrong, right? Like it gets me from just a journalistic perspective. That's the one thing people actually are supposed to care about. The one thing, I can say myself, if I say, 2004 instead of 2002, I feel bothered about it for the rest of the day, right? Like the idea that you had a journalistic outlet where people don't care about being wrong is indicative of how fundamentally flawed and problematic Fox is. But the other thing is this, which again doesn't surprise me. If you have a workplace that is fundamentally unfair, then the values and ethics that you tend to build the rest of your product on are always going to fall by the wayside. If you have a sexist office, it's easier to have an office where you just lie because you're already gaslighting most of your women's employees. If you have a racist office, it's very easy to see that you'll cheat because if you'll cheat an African-American employee or a Latino employee out of their fair pay, why wouldn't you cheat the customers and consumers that you're working with? So all of the things that we have talked about in Fox News over the years, the sexism, the harassment, the abuse, and everything else like that, it's not surprising that manifests itself in lying. And this is just another person adding another piece to the puzzle. But we have been seeing this picture for 20 years now.
I mean, I think to your point, too, Jason, this isn't some investigation in this case done by the New York Times, although they've done some incredible reporting on Fox News. This is someone from deep inside Fox News. A lot of what we know from this lawsuit, we know from the emails sent from one senior Fox News executive to another, from one primetime Fox News anchor to another. And it includes their disgust and disdain for Donald Trump. Let me read this to you, Jason. This is from a February 27th filing in the Dominion case from Rupert Murdoch talking about Sean Hannity. Quote, Paul Ryan believed that some high percentage of Americans thought the election was stolen because they got a diet of information telling them the election was stolen from what they believed were credible sources. Rupert Murdoch responded to Paul Ryan's email, quote, thanks, Paul. Wake up call for Hannity, who has been privately disgusted by Trump for weeks but was scared to lose viewers. The privately disgusted Sean Hannity, less than 22 hours ago, hosted the person that discussed him on his airwaves, I believe, for the whole hour last night. The cycle hasn't been interrupted. The cycle hasn't been slowed. The disgusted anchor who, according to Rupert Murdoch, had a, quote, wake-up call, hasn't woken up at all. And at a rally in Waco, where Trump's most senior political advisor, Roger Stone, has deep roots. He dedicated his book, Smearing the Clintons, to the Branch Davidians. The cycle is spinning in overdrive.
It's amazing to me, and it's not that we should be shocked that any of these people are spineless or feckless or dishonest or disingenuous, but it's amazing to me how they can be exposed to loathe each other and will still play kissy face in public, right? Like Tucker Carlson's like, I think Trump is demonic. And then days later, he's like, I talked to Trump on the phone. Sean Hannity is like, I don't really think this stuff. I'm disgusted by Trump, whatever. But then he'll get right back and have these people on TV. It's if they don't care about not just being dishonest, but they don't even care about the fact that they deeply, deeply hate and revile each other and have been exposed to revile each other, but they will still circle the wagons in favor of a man who tried to actively take over the government, who sends his entire team to have a campaign rally at a place that is considered one of the birthplaces of the modern militia movement in America, because we can't overlook the fact that Waco and the sort of raid on the Branch Davidians is one of the activating causes to the Patriot movement and all those white nationalist movements that began in the 1990s in the United States. So it's not shocking to me. Again, I had little or no expectations of Tucker or any of these people, but the fact that they can still find a way to smile in each other's faces and work together when they clearly can't stand each other is amazing. I've seen spy versus spy cartoons with people putting knives in each other's backs that seem to have more love and camaraderie and respect amongst colleagues than you see amongst Fox News and the Republican Party.
And the study for a psychiatrist or a sociologist is the shamelessness with which they dupe their viewers and the glee they seem to take in it. Like, no one that watches Fox will find out that Rupert said Sean is privately disgusted by him. Nobody watching last night knew that that was fake. It's amazing. We will be calling on all of you pretty regularly as we head into the final days and weeks ahead of this trial. Ronell, thank you very much for starting us off. Jeremy, thank you for your reporting on this. Jason sticks around a little bit longer when we come back. There's new reporting on how the possible indictment of the twice impeached, disgraced ex-president in Manhattan could impact the investigation into his attempts to overturn his election defeat in Georgia. One of the reporters working on that story will be our guest and will bring us inside his reporting after the break. Plus, fighting back against the GOP's unprecedented assault on public education and educators in America. It is so bad that a principal in Florida lost her job after Michelangelo's David was shown in art class. This is real. This really happened. What the head of one of the largest teachers' unions is proposing we do to stop what she calls an existential threat from extremist politicians. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
It was a pitch black night in the high desert. Sheriff's Deputy Billy Cox drove over the park and ride in Palmdale. Something very wrong around that bright blue Mustang. A woman's left leg and bare foot were hanging out of the door. L.A. County Homicide Detective Richard Longshore was sound asleep when he got the call.
There are cases that you will take home with you at night, and that will last till the end of your life.
I'm Keith Morrison, and this is The Girl in the Blue Mustang, a podcast from Dateline.
Listen now for free wherever you get your podcasts.
As viewers of this program know, there is no shortage these days of legal exposure for the twice impeached, disgraced ex-president. And there's a great example of how broad and how many investigations into him exist right now. You have in Manhattan his possible indictment by Alvin Bragg's office. You have in Fulton County, Georgia, as Greg Bluestein reports, a case that could present the most legal peril to him, where local and state officials now view Manhattan as possibly a preview. Bluestein writes in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution this, quote, the developments in New York could serve as a dry run for what may unfold in Atlanta, potentially later this spring. And they might take some heat off DA Fani Willis, at least in the short term, in assembling what could be a complicated conspiracy or racketeering case involving more than a dozen players. Joining our conversation, the aforementioned journalist Greg Bluestein of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Also joining us, former U.S. Attorney Glenn Kirshner. Greg and Glenn are both MSNBC contributors. Greg, take us through your reporting.
Well, look, Fulton County DA's office, Fani Willis and her associates, as well as law enforcement here in Georgia, they're very, very closely watching all the developments out of Manhattan, potential perp walk, the political fallout that is facing political leaders. All of it could be seen as a sort of dry run for what could happen here in Georgia if Fani Willis goes forward with what could be more expansive charges against Donald Trump and his inner circle. And in some ways, as we mentioned in the story, it could also relieve some of the pressure on Fani Willis if someone else goes first. But it also could also have an aftershock of even more scrutiny. So it just still remains to be seen. But I can tell you that folks here are very, very closely watching the developments in Manhattan as exactly that, a dry run.
You know, Glenn, Viewers of this program know how important I find the Southern District of New York's investigation into the very same acts of campaign finance violations that Alvin Bragg is looking into, because it was Bill Barr's Justice Department. It was SDNY under Donald Trump and Bill Barr that found that Donald Trump had, quote, directed and coordinated a hush money scheme silencing Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels weeks ahead of the 2016 election. What Alvin Bragg is investigating is really just matching an investigation that's already happened. What Fani Willis is investigating is, frankly, work that should have been done by Merrick Garland in the hours after the Capitol was attacked in an historic act described as domestic terrorism by people like Ted Cruz and Christopher Wray. So what do you make of these tenterhooks that prosecutors like Bragg and Willis are on right now in the vacuum created by DOJ?
You know, my overarching sense, Nicolle, is I can't understand the absence of overt law enforcement activity by the federal government, by the FBI, by the Department of Justice, which was my home for nearly a quarter of a century. So I don't say this with any delight. So state prosecutors are left to perhaps be the first ones to prosecute a former president of the United States. That is not how this should be unfolding, I contend. Donald Trump is a federal problem. The most serious crimes he committed are federal crimes. There should be a federal solution, and that should look like a federal indictment. And I'll tell you, my heart breaks for the criminal justice system, because when you look at the violence that Donald Trump continues to inspire up in New York, death and destruction if I'm indicted, you know, depicting Donald Trump holding a baseball bat, appearing like he's about to take a swing at the very district attorney who is prosecuting him down in Georgia. You know, when I read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporting, when they interviewed jurors and they said they were running a bomb-sniffing dog through the very grand jury room and the surrounding environs, and they had deputies and marshals posted on the courthouse steps protecting the public and protecting presumably the grand jurors. And it was reported that was on the day Mike Flynn testified. You know, Nicolle, I tried not one but two RICO cases in the courts of Washington, D.C., where we impaneled anonymous juries because of the danger the criminal organization we were prosecuting posed to jurors, to witnesses, to prosecutors, though, frankly, we were less concerned than we were for the jurors and the witnesses. And I don't think we saw 1/10 the security measures that we are seeing necessary up in New York and down in Georgia as a result of the conduct of Donald Trump, conduct that, as you say, should have been addressed by the federal government more than a year ago.
I mean, Glenn, I want to follow up. I mean, right now, and I just scratched a quick list together in the break, the IRS, the National Archives, the FBI after the attack at a field office, and DOJ are under heightened threat levels because of Donald Trump. So the notion that Donald Trump is a federal problem is established by the federal government in terms of their threat posture to protect themselves. That said, to your point, the people being threatened by Donald Trump on social media are Alvin Bragg with a baseball bat, Fani Willis with harsh attacks that Donald Trump disseminates to his millions of followers on social media. And I'll just say this, part of what exposes them, part of what makes them the highest points is that nothing has happened at the federal level. Is this perception that maybe there aren't federal crimes. But in both instances, frankly, in the hush money case, the federal government already alleged that he's an unindicted co-conspirator with Michael Cohen, who went to jail for the same crime. Michael Cohen didn't have the sex and he wasn't running for office. So the person who committed the crime and benefited from it was Trump in the eyes of SDNY. The conspiracy that Fani Willis appears to be investigating doesn't return Trump to the White House unless it's a multi-state one. It's nonsensical that these are state prosecutions in both instances. And I just wonder, when you're alone with your thoughts, what explanation can you arrive at that the federal government has for 2 years before Jack Smith been AWOL?
You know, I think of the argument that I made to my juries over and over again over the years when there were lots of inexplicable circumstances surrounding, let me use as an example, a murder trial. Rarely could I explain to, the satisfaction of 12 citizens sitting in a jury box as the conscience of the community, explain to their satisfaction a good reason for one person to take the life of another. But what I would always remind my jurors is, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to prove motive. We don't have to make it make sense, because if we were required to make it make sense, we would probably never win a conviction in, for example, a murder case. I rack my brain for why we have seen this, complete lack of overt law enforcement action from the Department of Justice. I can't explain the inexplicable, but when you see, for example, just take one instance of him posting the baseball bat about to be swung at Alvin Bragg, that not only violates New York law, interfering with governmental administration by trying to intimidate a public official, it also violates federal law, Nicolle. You are posting something on the internet, which means you're transmitting it in interstate commerce, and it's a threat against a public official. In fact, it can be a threat against any person that you post in interstate commerce, and it would be a federal criminal offense. Why we don't see at least some incremental charging of Donald Trump as they continue to investigate in the grand jury and build towards subsequent or superseding indictments. Why don't we see some incremental overt law enforcement action that will at least send the signal none of this is acceptable? That I can't explain.
And Greg, it brings us back to your fantastic reporting. I want to read this quote from your story. Quote, "The Georgia charges are far more serious and personally, I think, easier to prove." That's according to Tom Morgan, a former DeKalb district attorney. Quote, "Bragg has to jump through hoops to make what Trump did in New York a felony. Should Trump be indicted in Georgia, the acts speak for themselves." Still a real sense among close watchers and legal experts that the evidence that has been amassed in Fani Willis's probe is devastating potentially to Trump.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of it, right? Of course, we've heard that famous phone call with Brad Raffensperger. And I can tell you that Fani Willis did not go out looking for this fight. She was before federal prosecutors, before other prosecutors decided what they would do or wouldn't do. One of the first things she did was she looked up where Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, lives, and reminded herself that, wow, he lives in my jurisdiction. He lives in Fulton County. And so to her and her retelling of it, she had no choice but to bring these actions forward. And yeah, look, there's a lot more evidence, but there's also a lot more complications too, with bringing in a lot of his inner circle in this case as well.
Greg, for your great reporting on this, thank you so much, and for joining us. Glenn Kirshner, for all of your insights and your wisdom, thank you very much. When we come back, the president of one of the country's most powerful teachers' unions is fighting back today against what she calls an existential threat from culture war peddling politicians. What Randy Weingarten is proposing now amid a right-wing assault on education and educators and her. That's next.
Hey everybody, it's Savannah Guthrie.
And I'm Hoda Kotb, and we've got some great news to share.
The Today Show is now available wherever you get your podcast.
Can you believe that? Right now, you can get your daily dose of news and headlines and the day's top interviews from us right here every single morning.
We have what you need to start your day, and it's available every day, wherever you get your podcast.
So why not subscribe and follow today to start listening?
And I have a friend in Nashville, so I knew of one of the little girls who is 9, who went to school yesterday and who didn't get to come home. So when Henry came home from work, I said, God, did you see this?
Yeah.
And I had to whisper because I have a 9-year-old who was doing her homework. We are worried about giving our kids Judy Blume and other books that are important to the history, to the fabric of our country. And we aren't worried about sending our kids to schools where they're not safe.
Jenna Bush Hager there with a powerful and logical point about just how over the top and out of touch and insane the conversation and all the policies and efforts behind those conversations to ban books is in light of the uncomfortable truths about the lack of safety from guns in classrooms. It's not just reading books anymore, though. Although, as we've reported, attempts to ban books doubled in 2022 over the year before, when they were already alarmingly high, according to the American Library Association. Now, the censorship effort is now in overdrive, extends well beyond bookshelves. Washington Post reported today that the parent of a second grader in St. Petersburg, Florida, filed a formal objection against a Disney movie about Ruby Bridges, the first grader who had to wade through a white mob just to go to school at a newly integrated school in the South. That parent's reasoning was that the movie might teach children that, quote, white people hate black people, end quote. While you're scratching your head, stay with us, it gets worse. A Florida charter school principal said last week she was forced to resign for not contacting the parents of students in a 6th grade class, wait for this, an art class, before exposing them to what one parent equated to pornographic material. Warning to our viewers now, if you're offended by priceless, sort of boring works of Renaissance art, avert your eyes. Michelangelo's 16th century David marble statue is now the latest target of the censorship mobs. The bizarre nature of that resignation even registered abroad. The mayor of Florence, Italy, where the masterpiece is held, lives, called mistaking art for pornography ridiculous and invited the former principal for a visit to give her special recognition. Joining our conversation, President of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten. Jason Johnson, professor of Morgan State University, is still with us. Randy, I like that Jenna Bush sort of made the connection that every parent is making. We're now at drop-off aware as moms and dads and grandparents or caregivers that it is not impossible for our kids to lose their lives at an elementary school. We also know for sure, 100% of us, that from 3 years old on, our babies participate in active shooter drills because of that possibility. And I wonder what you make of the parallel conversation over on Earth 2 about banning books and art.
Well, you know, it's intended, the parallel conversation is intended to scare people and create fear. And the conversation that does actually create fear, we're not solving. So it is a little crazy making, but I think what's happening, Nicolle, is that the point by these cultural war operators and operatives, and frankly, I saw it today in my speech when I called on us to do a moment of silence for the Tennessee Christian school to, you know, in a speech that I was giving to public school parents and teachers, but to also renew a call for the assault weapons ban. And then somebody doctored the speech and said I was calling to confiscate guns. So all day long, that's what I've been dealing with. But the point is, the point they want to make is to widen the despair, widen the anxiety, and not actually solve the problems we need to solve, which is gun violence, learning loss, the sadness that kids have. And so what I tried to do today in my speech and in the defense of public education was to talk about not just the problems, but 4 things we could actually do to transform education in America.
Randy, I've played the clip of Mallory McBrown making the point that no child alive today is responsible for slavery. Are you aware of any child alive today going home sad or upset and feeling responsible for slavery? Has that anecdote ever made its way to you, that a child exposed to the history of slavery was ever sad or upset?
No. I mean, none of that has happened. But what it does happen, I think, is this. Conflict is natural in everyday life. And so when you see the murder of George Floyd, and you see a cop putting his knee on Floyd's neck, and you witness that murder, It's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. But what it should mean is, what do we do about it? And what teachers do is, we deal with conflict all the time, but we have to teach kids the skills of dealing with conflict. That's why we have social emotional learning. That's why we try to do the work in history courses and current events courses. What's happening here is that people are afraid of the future and afraid of what kids are learning. And that's why I think you see this really misguided, undermining and bad attempt to ban books or to ban anything that actually creates some thoughtful exchange of information about how to bridge differences. That's what's venal about this. But I want to say one more thing, which is there's nothing about any of the book bans or the culture wars that actually advance the proposition of how we help kids learn and how we help kids overcome learning loss and how we help kids overcome sadness. And so part of what we have to do is not just take on the book banning and take on what frankly is this divide, but do the intentional things we need to do to help create great joy in schools, experiential learning, meet parents' needs, wrap services around schools, and deepen the parent-teacher connection. So the problem is we got to take all of this on, plus the education and social, emotional, academic things we need to do at the same time as we're saying that the book bans are bad.
Jason, I say to my 11-year-old all the time, it is really hard to be a kid. And by 11, you know exactly what the active shooter drills are for. You've got a phone and you know where it is. You know, it's in your backpack, in your locker. But none of what's hard comes from reading books. I mean, none of what kids are struggling with is from, let me just read some of the books that have been banned. I mean, Jenna mentioned Judy Blume books, Toni Morrison's Beloved and Blue Quest, Dead After Dark, Doing It, Dreaming in Cuban, Forever, Gross Gods, Killing Mr. Griffin, Outlander, Perfectly Normal, The Hate You Give, The Kite Runner, The Truth About Alice. I mean, the books that are being banned are books that everyone should be exposed to, everyone should have access to, and a whole lot of people would benefit immensely from.
And Nicolle, for all the fears and concerns about what a kid's going to learn from The Hate You Give or what a kid's going to learn from a Judy Blume book, which we all grew up on, I don't hear any of these parents concerned about that story about two teenagers having unprotected sex, running away from home, and then killing each other. You know, Romeo and Juliet, that one. That we all read. You don't hear parents getting concerned about the incredibly disturbing stories that we read and that were a part of everybody's curriculum and education, which is why, Nicolle, as disturbing as this all is, and these attacks on education, and we know where it's coming from, these parents have been sort of empowered to be gadflies that 25 years ago we would have ignored. But there is a solution to all this. We can't stop the culture wars. We can't stop the racists. We can't stop those kinds of people. But what you can do, either at a state level or your city council level or your school board level, you don't even have to run for office. But there just need to be policies put in place that one parent can't stop everybody from watching something. What's so crazy about this case in St. Petersburg with the Ruby Bridge movie is the parent who filed the complaint, her kids didn't even see the documentary. She had the right to pull them out. And if you are not a parent in that school and you don't have a child in that class, you should have absolutely no standing to stop other kids from being able to watch something. I have had the opportunity to see all sorts of things when I was in school. I ask my students about this all the time. And if you have a parent that has a problem with an issue, you just opt out of it. But you don't have the right to stop everybody else from learning just because you don't want your child exposed to something.
I want to push both of you on why these issues work. I have to sneak in a quick break. Randy Weingart and Jason Johnson are sticking around. Don't go anywhere. We're back with Randy and Jason. Jason, there's this scene in Field of Dreams where, you know, it's about banning books. It's about standing up at a meeting, the kind of meeting you're talking about, and saying, you know, defending the right to have books. This is an old fight. Why is it so virulent right now today?
So it's because
I'm sorry, Randy. Let me get Jason first, and then I'll give you the last word, Randy.
Yeah, It's virulent right now because you have a large swath of Americans, and in particular white Americans, but sometimes other kinds of people who don't feel empowered. This goes back to Barack Obama talking about when people feel insecure, they cling to God and guns. They have been told that you're losing your country to gay people, you're losing your country to black people, you're losing your country to brown Hispanic people, you're losing your country. And so people are lashing out and trying to grab in whatever thing they can so they feel like they're in some control. And if that means getting a book banned, having something taken out of school, or stopping a movie, it makes people feel better. I don't care about a national level of insecurity. I'm more concerned about things like inflation in the environment and fighting COVID. And I don't think that we can change or convince these people that what they're doing isn't helpful. What we have to do is have a serious national conversation. I don't care if the president thinks that he's above this right now. We have to have a serious national conversation about what education is actually about and holding people accountable and not letting every individual family's temper tantrum or inability to deal with history and common sense become the concern for everybody else. We had wackadoodle parents when I was a kid. It's fine. They can take their kids, put them wherever they want to put them, but they can't become a terror to everybody else in the school system.
Randy, you get the last word.
So look, Jason's right. I mean, I think it's that people are fearful. There's a lot of anxiety, particularly in the aftermath of COVID. And these cultural war orchestrators are trying to just exacerbate it. But the bottom line is, education is for all. That is why we have a public education system. And we cannot let a minority of vocal people, some of whom are maybe parents, some of whom are not, kill this, undermine this for all the kids in America. And we need to stand up for all the kids in America. That's what we're doing.
Now you've got Florence, Italy involved as well. What a mess. Randy, Jason, thank you so much for spending time with us on this today. We'll stay on it. A quick break for us. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for letting us into your homes during these truly extraordinary times. We are grateful.
Hey, everybody, it's Hoda Kotb.
And Jenna Bush Hager.
And we got big news, y'all. Our show is now a podcast.
That's right. You can take us anywhere you go, in your car, to the gym, even just at home on your own couch with a glass of wine.
We like spending time with each other, and now we love that we can spend even more time with you. Are you sick of us yet?
Don't be, because you can never have to miss a moment of fun, laughs, or friendship.
Yeah, subscribe. Listen to Today with Hoda and Jenna wherever you get your podcasts.